wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. I found a place to live in a boarding house. Mr. Rutledge was the owner. And while I was living there, I tried my hand at different jobs. I was a shopkeeper. I worked in the shop. I was a postmaster. I delivered mail miles and miles all over the county. I tried to be a land surveyor, and that didn't work out too well. I tried all different kinds of things, trying to find where I fit in. I didn't really have a whole lot of friends until one day, I made one of my best friends I would ever have in my entire life. His name was Jack Armstrong. Jack was a part of a group, your teacher told me you might call it a gang. We just called them the Clary's Grove Boys. And the Clary's Grove Boys, they came up to me, and their leader, Jack Armstrong at the time, he challenged me to a wrestling match. Well, they didn't know who they were talking to. I politely declined and said, "Sir, I have no quarrel with you. I do not wish to wrestle you." And they said I had no choice. So I obliged, and I proceeded to pin Jack Armstrong in about 3 seconds. Well, his Clary's Grove Boys didn't like that very well, and they decided all of them were going to jump on me at the same time. And Jack Armstrong stood up and he said, "Don't you put a hand on him. He has proved himself and he's earned our respect. He is one of us." And from that day on, Jack Armstrong and I were the best of friends. Kind of a weird way to make a friend, but he was one of my best friends my entire life. While I was living there, I also met a pretty young lady. Her name was Ann Rutledge. She was Mr. Rutledge's daughter at the boarding home where I lived. And we courted for some time. Do you know what courted means?
Yes.
Oh, what's a word that you might call it these days? Yeah. It would be similar to what your teacher said would be called dating. We courted for some time, and we fell in love, and I proposed marriage to her. Sadly, she passed away. She got really sick with typhoid fever and passed away. That was kind of a hard time for her. But I decided I was going to continue and go on with my life. I decided to run for government, local government there, Illinois State Legislature. And the people of New Salem elected me, and I served 6 terms in the Illinois State Legislature. While I was there, I met a good man named John Todd Stewart. He was a lawyer from Springfield, Illinois, one of the biggest cities in Illinois at the time. And he told me, "Mr. Lincoln, you would be a good lawyer. Have you ever thought about being a lawyer?" I hadn't really given it much thought. I decided I'd try my hand at it. Now, to be a lawyer, you have to pass a test called the bar exam. Well, I didn't know anything about being a lawyer, and so I found every book I could find about being a lawyer, and I read it, and studied, and read it, and I taught myself how to be a lawyer, and I took that test, and I passed. And I became a lawyer, and I went to work for Mr. Stewart at his law office. And right about a year later, after I started working for him, he quit. He left. He wanted to go work in Washington, D.C., so I was left with no partner. Well, luckily I had met a man by the name of William H. Herndon. He and Mr. Stewart had convinced me to move to Springfield from New Salem where I could have more work as a lawyer. So I moved to Springfield, and Mr. Herndon and I, we became law partners, and we had an office together. And it was a pretty messy office because Mr. Herndon hated the fact that I didn't really have what you might call a sophisticated file system. I used to stack papers all over the room, leave them laying about. Anything important though? Right here in the top hat. So I knew where all my important stuff was. Now while I was living in Springfield, I came across one of the most beautiful women I'd ever met in my entire life. I was invited to a party by Mr. Edwards, Ninian Edwards. He was a very local, or well-known local gentleman, owned one of the nice big houses outside of the city. He invited me to a party at his house, and I walked in, and there she was standing across the room. She was a sight. And boy, was I scared. I was really scared of women. I was really afraid of women when I was growing up. They scared me to death. So I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know if I should go talk to her. I didn't know if I should just stare at her. That might be So I wasn't sure quite what to do, and I built up the courage, and I walked up to her, and I asked her if she'd like to have a dance. Sure enough, we danced and talked for the rest of the night. Her name was Mary Todd. We ended up courting for some time, and I asked her for her hand in marriage. She obliged, and I kind of got a little scared, and I got some cold feet, and I broke the engagement off, and I got really depressed. It was sad. We call it the bout of melancholy. I had a bout of melancholy. I locked myself away in my room. Mr. Herndon was so worried about me, he even took my shaving razor away, thinking I might do something to myself. He was worried about how depressed I was. One day he came and he sat next to me on the bed and said, "Abraham, do you love her?" I said, "Yeah, I love her." He said, "Then why are you sitting in this bed?" And I couldn't find a good reason. So I got up out of that bed and I walked over to Mr. Edwards' house where she was staying. And I knocked on the door and she came to the door and I begged her to take me back. And after some convincing, she finally obliged. So we ended up getting married. November 4th, 1842. Did anybody know how many children we had?
3.
4 children. Very well done. Nice job. We did have 4 boys. Our first son was named Robert. We called him Bob. Robert and I had a strained relationship. We weren't the best relationship, him and I, but he and Mother got along very well. Mother was what I called Mary Todd after we got married and had kids. I referred to her as Mother. Mother and Robert got along very well. Our second son, his name was Edward. We called him Eddie. Edward sadly passed away when he was 4 years old. He died of tuberculosis. That was very hard on Mother and I. For about a year, we mourned his passing. We decided we'd bring another young'un into the family. Decided to have a 3rd child. His name was William Wallace Lincoln. We called him Willie. He lived till he was about 11 years old and he passed away. He passed away of typhoid. Now, when he passed away, that's when I was president at the time. He passed away while I was in the White House. Mother never quite recovered from that one. It was a tough time for her. Our 4th child, though, lived somewhat of a full life. He passed away when he was 18. His name was Thomas. I named him after my father. I called him Tad, though. We nicknamed him Tad. And that's actually a pretty funny story. When he was born, I remember holding him in my arms. I looked at him, he had such a tiny little body and a really huge head. He looked just like a tadpole. And so we called him Tad. That was his nickname. We called him Tad for his mom. But sadly, he passed away when he was 18 years old with tuberculosis also. So Robert is the only one that actually lived to be an adult. He would actually go on to live until he was 82 years old. But we loved our children very much. Mr. Herndon did not like my children very much. My law partner did not enjoy having the children in the law office with me very much. I used to bring them to work with me, and they would run along the tables and kick the papers, and draw on the walls. Willie even peed in the corner one time. Mr. Herndon didn't like them very much, but he tolerated them. Mother didn't like Mr. Herndon very much either. I remember a story one time where Mother refused to ever let him into our house. Said that Mr. Herndon will never be allowed in our house because one day he described her as, what was his words? She was as elegant as a serpent. He basically called her a snake. She didn't like that very much. He said he meant it in a nice way. I'm not sure about that. But Mother never liked him, and he was never allowed to come over to our home. Well, shortly after that, I decided to run for the United States House of Representatives for the city of Springfield, and I won for our district. And I served one term, from 1847 to 1849, and I was not reelected. And I had a bout of depression and melancholy, and I felt I would never be in politics again. So I went back to being a lawyer and enjoying my law practice. Until one day, this short, tiny, round gentleman by the name of Stephen Douglas came up with this idea called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Have you guys heard of that yet?
Yeah.
Oh, you have heard of it. Well, he came up with that Kansas-Nebraska Act, and I did not like that very much. See, I was a Whig. I was part of the Whig Party. We do not agree with the spread of slavery. And Mr. Douglas wanted to allow the potentiality for the spread of slavery. And I was not about to have that. I challenged him to a set of debates across the state of Illinois. We debated on many issues, but it always ended up coming back to slavery. I ran against him for the seat of the United States Senate for the state of Illinois, and I lost. I lost to Mr. Douglas, and I suffered with a bout of depression and melancholy again, thinking I'd just run out of chances to be in any importance in the government. Well, about 2 years later, 1860 came around, and there was a new political party. The Whigs had broken up and disbanded, and a few of them decided to start a new party called the Republican Party. And they came to me and they said, Mr. Lincoln, would you like to be a candidate for the President of the United States for the Republican Party? Well, I laughed at first because I thought there was no way I was even qualified to be President of the United States. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, they were convinced that I could. So I obliged, and I decided to be their candidate for president. And wouldn't you know it, I won the election. I won. I became President of the United States. And the first thing that happened is the southern states started leaving. South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas. They all decided they were going to leave and start their own country. Well, I couldn't have that. And one of the things they tried to do is they tried to take one of our federal forts. Fort Sumter, have you heard of that one?
Yep.
Well, they tried to take over that fort, and I didn't know what to do. One of our officers down there, his name was Major Robert Anderson. Major Robert Anderson wrote a letter to me and said that he would hold down that fort as long as he could, but he was running low on supplies and needed some support. Well, I had a decision to make. If I send those ships down to help him, those southern states said that that would be an act of war, an invasion of their territory. Well, I didn't agree. I didn't see them as a separate country. To me, they were a part of the United States. States in an act of rebellion. So I made the decision to send those ships. And it started again. It did start a war known as the Civil War. One of the hardest things on my conscience I ever had to live with. I feel somewhat responsible for the death of over 620,000 men. And that weighed on my conscience every day. But I kept my goal of keeping the Union together, and I succeeded. During that war, there was a famous battle known as the Battle of Gettysburg. I'm assuming you've heard of that one as well. After that battle, a few months later, they asked me if I'd give a speech commemorating it as a national cemetery. I didn't want to speak too long. I didn't want to make it into something bigger than it was. But I obliged them, and I said I would write a speech. So I gave it. Would you like to hear that speech?
Yes.
Fourscore-and-7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated could long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. Well, it's altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. These brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated far beyond our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. And it's rather for us the living to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you. I do love that speech. I didn't do too much about that speech, but it was nice that they asked me to do it, and I was glad I could. Well, when the war ended, I was so tired, so very tired of what I'd gone through. And Mother and I decided to have a relaxing evening. We decided to take in a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Well, she didn't want to go at first. She had a headache, and she didn't. And I convinced her to go, and I said, "We need to go. We need to enjoy ourselves and get a break from all the stress we've been dealing with." So we went, and we took our friend Major Rathbone and his fiance, and we sat up in the presidential box at Ford's Theater, and we watched a play called Our American Cousin, a very nice comedy that I had seen before. And I was sitting next to Mother, and I got the urge, and I went out and I grabbed her hand as we were sitting there. She was a little startled. Normally, we didn't show any displays of affection while we were in public. And so when I grabbed her hand, she says, "What will people think, you grabbing my hand like this in public?" Well, I said, "They'll think nothing of it, dear. They'll think nothing of it." That's the last thing I remember that night. After that, it all went black. I don't really remember much. Now, I do remember, and what I want you to remember is not the man that passed away that night. I want you to remember the man that got to that point. The man who fought for his education. The man who fought to become the lawyer, the leader, the man with strong character. That's the man I want you to remember. Yes, I was President of the United States during a very important time in our lives, but I was more than that. Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me.